Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 28, Section 3, the Holocaust. And I want to talk a little bit about this fellow right here. If you read in your book, there is a little story about Władysław Spielman. And kind of going back maybe to Section 1 notes of Chapter 28, Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. And what's weird is on that date, Spielman was playing basically a performance on Polish radio. He was playing Chopin's Nocturne in C sharp as the Germans invade and literally crush the radio towers and for the most part knock the whole radio system off the air in Poland. Okay. Spielman, for the most part, goes kind of underground. And by about 1944, he is actually found in hiding by a German soldier. And for some reason, these two guys get into a dialogue, and Spielman tells the soldier that he is actually a pianist. And needless to say, the soldier wants to hear him play. And he sits down, hasn't played the piano for years, and he starts knocking out some of these beautiful concert pieces. And what's fascinating is the German soldier who could have turned him in doesn't do so. And Spielman is basically hidden and survives the war. And so when the war ends in 1945, it's ironic that Spielman is invited back to play his nocturne, Chopin's Nocturne in C sharp, on Polish radio once Poland is actually able to put the radio system back online, which is, kind of ironic, but yet at the same time, it's the thing that we make motion pictures about. So if you ever see the movie The Pianist, that's kind of what this is all about. But it does kind of talk a little bit about, the situation that we have here. We mentioned prior to this back in Chapter 27 that, anti-Semitism was definitely a big issue when we talk about, leading to the Holocaust or the Shoah. And the Nazis had passed a series of laws in 1935 known as the Nuremberg Laws that created a separate legal status for Jews. It denied them citizenship, the right to hold government jobs, limited their right to work. They couldn't own property. And basically it led to thousands of German Jews being deported. Before the war begins, really even before Hitler comes to power, there is roughly 9 million Jews that are living in Europe. And a lot of them are living outside of Germany. It's not just, they're all living there. They're living throughout the continent. And as these laws start going into place, there are some Jews that do leave, meaning that they're able to get a visa to go to another nation. Though I will say this, there were a lot of Jews that applied for visas here to the United States, and because of the series of basically immigration laws that we had passed after World War I, we had very strict quotas on who we could allow to come into this nation. And during the time of the Great Depression, we really weren't encouraging a lot of people to come into our country because we didn't have a lot of jobs. So when things get really, kind of tight, we're not open to this idea of helping the Jews like we should have been as a nation. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of the final solution, a little bit of what kind of led to that. And we'll talk about that. But anytime we talk about this idea of the final solution, we are usually thinking about ideas of the deliberate mass murder of Jewish prisoners in German-controlled areas. And this could mean, people who were living obviously in Germany, but we're talking about Poles, we're talking about sometimes even Italian Jews, we're talking about French Jews, Jews that were in the Netherlands, anyone that could have been in these areas that were occupied by the Germans certainly that's who we're talking about. Uh, because of this forced a lot of Jews into ghettos. And this is kind of where this all begins. It starts really prior to the Second World War really beginning, but Jews were kind of forced out of their neighborhoods, and shortly after, like Kristallnacht, the German military basically gathered up some very wealthy Jews and told them, like, you can either pay for your freedom, and we'll let you out, or you can suffer the consequences. And some, basically surrendered all their wealth, were able to get out of Germany, but others, obviously, it's like, this is our life savings, we're not going to surrender that. And many of them ended up being forced into these ghettos. And these were areas that, for the most part, were kind of like jails. I mean, they were, neighborhood areas that had dilapidated buildings. They were walled in with barbed wire. They had troops that were guarding this area. So if you tried to leave, you would probably be shot. But what ends up happening is, because of the fact that there's so many controls on this area, a lot of people were not getting food, and they starved to death, or they died of disease, or were shed. They were defiant, they were shot by the Germans. When we talk about concentration camps actually began really well before the war began. One of the first camps that was built in 1933, and it was meant to be a detention center. This idea of concentrating means to, like, put a whole bunch of people together so you can watch them. And so the first camp was built basically to house political prisoners or enemies of the state. And eventually this became to house not only just those, but Jews and anybody who would, basically be targeted by the Nazis. Okay. If you were in a concentration camp, in many cases you were forced to perform slave labor. And as along with that, they might be subjected to really inhumane medical experiments, even severe hunger, because a lot of times these people were put on literally what would be called the starvation diet. Okay. When we talk about the final solution, we kind of got to get into talking about some of the bad stuff, the horrors here. And when Germany, for the most part, is officially at war, they eventually are going to invade Russia. And they're going to go into lands that are kind of held by Slavic people. And just so you know, Slavs were kind of considered to be enemies for the Germans, and they were seen as being, not as pure as Germans and such. There were a lot of Russian Jews that were living in lands, obviously, in Poland and Germany, or in Russia as well. And in September of 1941, Germans, for the most part, had sent out mobile killing units. Okay, and at Baba Yar, they ended up massacring roughly 35,000 people. And this is an area that was in Soviet territory. It was a mass execution. And what makes it even more horrendous is that some of the local Soviet officials, local police, people in general, joined in on this. The problem with this, aside from the fact that it was just downright evil and such, was the fact that with these mass executions, okay, and just so you know, Baba Yar is not very far from Kiev, which is a pretty big city within Russia, is that there's a lot of evidence, a lot of witnesses, and certainly a lot of people that could, say what's going on. And certainly the Nazis didn't want to necessarily get some of this out as fodder to the field to fight them. And so they needed to find another way. And that leads us to this Wannsee conference that's going to happen in January of 1942. And it's basically a meeting of some of the Nazi leaders, a lot of them Gestapo, secret police leaders, to determine the final solution. And what it did is it established the procedures that they were going to use to round up and send Jews to concentration camps. And it also established the extermination camps that were going to be outside of Germany, with the idea of executing those people who were the sick, the infirm, or the very, very young. If you were sent to one of those extermination camps, and just so you know, all of the extermination camps, or the AKA the death camps, are outside of Germany. A lot, for the most part, located primarily in Poland. But if you were sent there, not only was it a death camp, but it also had kind of the other side, the concentration camp. And so people would get off the trains after they had been transported there, and they would be sorted out. And those who could be laborers were sent one way, and obviously the infirmed, the sick, the very young would be sent primarily to the death camps. And within those death camps, you had basically we would call like the gas chambers. Okay, Hitler established these special concentration camps in Poland with the main purpose of killing a large number of Jews. Camps like Auschwitz or even Treblinka, they were known as death camps, and they had these showers. Okay, that for the most part were not really showers. What they were was a gas chamber, and they would put in basically a pesticide known as Cyclone B, or a fertilizer, I should say. And they would put that in there, and they could gas roughly 12,000 people a day. Usually a chamber like this could hold roughly 2,000 people at one time. Okay, they're all going to be literally packed in there. And the gas chambers were usually located very close to the crematorium. And so to get rid of the evidence, unlike what they had with, Baba Yar, they would gas, and then prisoners would be forced to move the bodies to the crematorium where they would be cremated. And for the most part, these furnaces would be burning all the time. A lot of times people wonder why was this such a secret? Because the smell would certainly kind of give away to the people around that area that something bad was happening. But I think some of it was the fear. Nobody wanted to challenge the Nazis because they were afraid of what could happen to them. But places like Auschwitz, in the course of the whole war, they could execute roughly, 12,000 people a day. In the end, they executed 1.6 million people just at Auschwitz. And of that 1.6, 1.3 million were Jews. So it was a horrendous situation that happened here. Bergen-Belsen, which was just a straight old concentration camp that was located within Germany. The British liberated this camp, and they found roughly 35,000 bodies, 60,000 survivors, and a lot of these people were emaciated. It was horrendous what they found. And because of the fact that many of these people had been starving slowly, you just couldn't necessarily free them, because of the fact that if they started eating, they could actually, that would kill them as well. So many of these prisoners were kept here, detained, so that they could get nourishment and then eventually be relocated, so that they could kind of start rebuilding their lives. But when we talk about some of the camps, the Soviets basically started figuring out that some of these things were happening. In 1944, they found the remains of one camp. By January of 45, Soviet troops had liberated Auschwitz, and they found 7,000 survivors there, and they could kind of see what had been happening, and some of that information got out. And so by the time the Allies start liberating camps like Bergen-Belsen, or for U.S. troops, Buchenwald, we kind of knew what had happened. And it really changes the attitude, because a lot of our Allied leaders wanted to make sure that their soldiers saw what they were fighting for. They knew that the Germans were bad, but they didn't realize how bad until they saw what they had done to their own people. And what's interesting, to kind of, make sure that the civilians near these camps knew what was happening. British and American troops basically gathered up civilians living in towns near these concentration camps and made them come and view what they had been supporting over the years. And for some of these people, they were in total denial that this had actually taken place. So the Jewish population, when we look at the war and such, I mentioned before the war began, we had well over 9 million Jews that were living in Europe. After the war, only about 3.5 million Jews are going to survive. And certainly there's going to be this desire to get revenge. The man that you see photographed here, this guy was a pretty bad dude. His name was Adolf Eichmann. He was actually at the Wannsee Conference. He was a member of the Gestapo. He was basically one of those guys that had been entrusted to carry out the final solution. And when the war kind of is winding down and the Allies are starting to liberate some of these camps, Eichmann flees Germany. He actually goes to Argentina. And the Israeli government, after World War II is over, we have the establishment of Israel as a nation in 1948. One of the things that they wanted to do is to go out and find these Nazis and try them for war crimes. And so in roughly 1960, Eichmann is literally kidnapped from Argentina. He's brought back to Israel to stand trial in 1961. Where he is found guilty, obviously, and he will be executed. Not only that, Israel is going to be continuing to look for these war criminals well into the 2000s. Even today, occasionally we're going to hear about individuals who are well into their 90s who are going to be found, and there's going to be a desire to extradite them back to Israel so that they can stand trial. All right. Thank you very much.